Hello, welcome to the 8th episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
And in this episode, we're going to be discussing Gremlins from 1984. This is our Christmas episode.
Merry Christmas.
To all.
How's the war on Christmas going for you, Mark?
I fight so hard every day.
Oh, perhaps we'll meet on the battlefield.
Next episode, something a little more secular, Beetlejuice from 1988. We're taking a little bit of a Christmas break, and then when we come back, it'll be Beetlejuice, and we'll be well prepared. And that will be ending our Scary Thoughts totally 80s triple threat block.
Yeah, we really went for it. And it seems to be the most popular subject matter, which I think has a lot to do with the general age of our audience.
Yeah. Well, you know, there is somewhat of a golden age in the 80s of like fun horror, approachable horror.
Right. I mean, this film, Gremlins, is right in the middle of the horror comedy explosion of 1984. I mean, this movie came out the same week that Ghostbusters did, and people were really starting to get that humor with their horror genre a little bit more and more frequently. And so people were starting to enjoy it. Although I think at this point, people didn't quite know what to make of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was also a lot of these films were like these hybrids of comedy and horror and family entertainment and some sort of vague political statement about one thing or another.
Right. And this movie really kicks off with Chris Columbus, who also wrote Goonies. And I can't remember what else he did, but he wrote this movie as a spec script. So that's one of the reasons why it's so out there and so weird, is that it was never going to get made. It was just never a thing that he thought was ever going to have to be committed to screen. And for about 40 years since the Looney Tunes cartoon where Bugs Bunny fights a gremlin in World War II in a bomber plane, there had been some chatter about making a Gremlins movie. And then this spec script was written, I believe, just sort of independent of that. And Spielberg had been, of course, connected in Hollywood, and he was looking to produce something under the Amblin banner. And he ran across this script and got Joe Dante to direct it, and he had just come off of The Howling, so he was a pretty well-known horror film director. But the thing that really put Joe Dante on Steven Spielberg's radar was his Jaws ripoff, Piranha. And apparently the studio was just hell-bent to sue him over Piranha, and they were just going to tear it up. But Steven Spielberg saw it, got the spoof, really enjoyed it, and immediately thought of him when it came time to make this movie.
Piranha's pretty fun. I actually got to give it to Joe Dante on Piranha. It's a pretty fun movie. But before we dive too far into Gremlins...
Yeah, we're really getting ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah, why don't you tell us, why don't you prepare the audience for what to and what not to expect?
Okay, we expect you to have seen this movie, Gremlins. You're not going to have as much fun if you haven't seen it, because it's not going to make any sense to you at all. This is a wild and woolly puppet movie that is incredible, and it demands to be seen. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Gremlins 2, because although you can talk about Gremlins without Gremlins 2, you can't talk about Gremlins 2 without Gremlins, because Gremlins 2 is a spoof of Gremlins, basically. And there's so much weirdness between the two movies and how they were made. I think it's just a really interesting Hollywood story to look at them together. So please see Gremlins. Please see Gremlins 2.
I don't think you need to see Gremlins 2 to listen to this episode.
Bullshit.
And
I mean, you don't have to, because we're mostly talking about Gremlins, but you should definitely see Gremlins 2.
Okay, you should see Gremlins 2, but I don't think it's a prerequisite for this episode.
Correct.
That's not homework you need to do.
But there's going to be lots of spoilers for Gremlins 2, so just prepare yourself.
In my opinion, that doesn't matter. It's a terrible movie and deserves to be spoiled.
And I'm going to explain why Mark is very wrong. As always... As always, please go over to iTunes and give us a rating and a review. We've gotten a few very nice ones lately. They just make my life so good. I don't know how, Mark, you feel about them, but I'm sure you have as much joy because of them as I do. They're phenomenal. They make me feel like the world is great, which is a good thing in this day and age of darkness.
You know what also brings me a lot of joy around Scary Thoughts, other than those comments and reviews, is the amazing work that our intern does on our Instagram page. It really is such an inspiring series of images and quotations.
Yeah, that's at scarythoughts.podcast. Go on there. Every morning I look at that before I go to work, and it really just prepares me for a day of crushing it, which I do every single day, mainly because of the excellent work of our intern. Hopefully one day we'll have enough money to pay her.
Maybe we should have her on one day.
One day.
Okay, so how are we going to approach this? I should say at the outset that most of what I'm probably going to say about Gremlins is going to contradict everything else that I say about Gremlins. I'm really conflicted about it. And that actually really manifested when I rewatched it to do this episode. I actually had to break it up in two parts just because of time. And I watched the first half and I was like, this is the worst piece of shit. I hate this movie so much. And then the next day I finished watching it and I was like, that was cool. That was fun. And I really feel like all of my thoughts about it are in conflict with each other. So if people want to call me out on being inconsistent, I'm like 2 steps ahead of you. Sorry.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me because the movie really does change gears about halfway through. I mean, for the first half of the movie, it's very nostalgic. You know, that's the whole thing. You start off with Hoyt Axton, who plays the father, his voiceover kind of setting the tone. He's walking through Chinatown. The very first scene, he walks past an AMC Gremlin, which is also the car from Wayne's World, if anybody's a car nerd. So Gremlin, haha. So he has this monologue about how, you know, it's Christmas time. He's an inventor. He kind of tells you who he is. His name's Rand Peltzer, which is pretty hilarious. Randall Peltzer, but I think there's probably some sort of nod to Ayn Rand there because of his totally kick-ass inventor job, I guess. I don't know.
Well, he's a failing entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So that might be a criticism of Ayn Rand is that he's a self-made man who can't provide for his family.
Well, I like to think that he's maybe has invented one thing because he has a pretty nice house in a pretty nice little town, although the economic situation seems to be depressed. And in deleted scenes, you find that one of the villainous old characters, the old lady, she is about to foreclose on everybody in town, basically. She's going to call in all the debts from the bank and force the bank to basically ruin this tiny little town.
So she's Ayn Rand.
She's basically Ayn Rand, yeah. I mean, she's also a cat lady. She has a cat named Old Dollar Bill. It's kind of amazing. But it starts off in Chinatown, and Rand Peltzer is looking for a gift for his son. And he goes into this old, crazy, down-the-stairs Chinatown junk shop, basically, and meets an old man who has one glass eye and is about as like stereotypical Chinatown old wizard guy as you can get. And he tries to wheel and deal with this creature, the Mogwai. And in the wheeling and dealing, it's kind of interesting because he offers him like $300, which at the time would have been a fortune, which is why I think that he's probably maybe not as much of a failing entrepreneur. Like maybe he's invented one thing and it's allowed him to get this house and this family and all this shit. But
it's because his 13-year-old son's working in a bank. I think that's where all that money comes from.
Yeah. He's definitely putting his whole family to work. The guy tells him he can't have the Mogwai, and then the grandson of the old man is a total dickhead. It's like, look, I'll just sell you this thing outside. Let's go outside. You can have it. He goes out there, sells this completely unique life form for $300, which is kind of weird. It's like maybe a dragon head or something like that for $300, but this weird little creature. And then what's funny about it is nobody ever asks anything about this thing. Like, where did it come from? Would you feed it? Does it need a litter box? Any of the questions you might buy. Like, I had exotic pets when I was a little kid. I had turtles and stuff. And there's always, like, care instructions. And
sure. Well, with the Mogwai comes great responsibility.
Right.
Which are just these 3 rules. But none of the actual day-to-day things that you need to know about life forms in general.
Right. Like, is this an old one? Is it a young one? I mean, he has no idea. It's like he's going in and buying some just creature.
Well, I think you're just starting to scratch the surface of one of the things I'm most conflicted with
Sure.
In this movie, which is that the rules, you know, everybody knows the rules about Gremlins. You don't even have to see the movie, and you probably know something about what the rules of this movie are.
Sure.
But the premise of the movie, those rules are completely ridiculous. And everything that unrolls from those rules are ridiculous. It's sort of like, against it and to its credit, the amount of suspension of disbelief you have to have for this entire movie, just starting with the very premise of it, which falls apart the second you put a question mark at the end of it, is really weird. Like, it's hard for me to think of movies, of any movie, that has such a deeply flawed and inconsistent premise.
Sure. Well, that's one way of looking at it. The way I look at it is far more fondly and generously. I look at this movie as a Looney Tunes cartoon.
Yes.
You know, and like to say it doesn't follow its own rules, it just doesn't care about rules.
Yes.
Like it just, you know, and the Looney Tune thing is really backed up by like some intertextual pieces, which is originally the World War II cartoon where Bugs Bunny fights an actual gremlin over the skies, Nazi Germany or Japan or wherever they're fighting. That was supposed to play at the beginning of Gremlins. And then Warner Brothers Looney Tunes was kind of like, man, this is too dark of a movie for us to connect to this Looney Tunes franchise. So no way. But at the bar later in a scene where Billy is sitting down, he's a wannabe cartoon artist. His mentor is actually Chuck Jones. So, you know, the famous cartoonist is sitting there kind of telling him his dragon head with his boss's face on it is cool work or whatever. And it's in this really beautifully lit bar. And I grew up in bars, pretty much. My parents are bartenders. And I remember just what Christmas lighting in bars looks like. And I think because so much of this movie is in the dark, because of the rules of the creatures, they can't be shown bright light or sunlight and it'll kill them. So much of this movie takes place in shadows or darkly lit rooms. And I think it is a really pretty movie because of that. And the idea that they wanted the film to be sort of look like it was staged, and they put it on a sound lot, and the town of Kingston Falls is also the town from Back to the Future. I mean, it's literally the same set. And they have this really cool, super cheesy matte painting in the background to kind of like walk out the sides of the town. And I think that all those elements that sort of make the movie look cheap, or the rules it doesn't follow, for me, I have a lot of fondness for that. Because to me, this movie doesn't give a shit about your rules. And that's one of the fun things about it.
Which is actually consistent with what the Gremlins themselves are.
Totally.
Which is just sowers of chaos. And so the premise of this movie is a total lack of adherence to the rules of filmmaking or narrative.
Right.
And sci-fi and suspension of disbelief. And then the narrative is actually driven by these instigators of chaos, this gang, essentially.
Yeah.
And we can get into that a little more later.
Sure.
But it's also, in that way, it's a very messy film about a bunch of people who make a mess.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And the town itself is just so picturesque and orderly that I think when things do start going off the rails, it is just such an extreme. You know, like you see, there's a scene where these like goofy cops that seem to be completely ineffective respond to a call, and they show up in the scene and there's gremlins crawling all over Santa Claus and basically killing him, and they just roll up the window and then drive off. But then they go through an intersection where a gremlin is changing the lights. You know, the gremlins are just, if anything, they're about just causing maximum damage at any time. And then the cop car flips over, and they talk about like some of the fun cheesiness. Like you can just totally see the stunt skid plate underneath the car when it flips over, and it's like obviously nobody cared. And this wasn't a really small budget movie either. It was $11 million, which was not the lowest and not the highest at the time, but it pulled in like $150+ million. And it wasn't even released as a Christmas movie, which is super weird. It was a summer blockbuster, which is odd, like that they would have even made this movie come out in the summer. And then when they re-released it a year later, they released it in the summer again. You would think that with all the merchandising that went on with this film, it would have made sense. Like you look right now, every Disney Star Wars movie is going to be released around Christmas forever. Like you want to sell plastic in the shape of heroic action people, and that's the time to do it. And it was so weird that it didn't even obey the rules of like the time it should have been released. I mean, it's an explicit Christmas movie, and it's one of my favorite Christmas movies because I think it gets the look of Christmas so right, or at least film Christmas.
Maybe your Christmas.
Well, I grew up in the South. I didn't see snow until I moved to California. So,
well, that whole picturesque small town thing. I mean, it really is It's hard to not think about Gremlins as being a moralistic movie. And I don't want to talk too much about Steven Spielberg because I don't want to find myself a cliche of someone who hates Spielberg,
Sure.
which I am. But it really, it is this story about like this beautiful small town USA. And, you even see It's a Wonderful Life playing on a TV in the background of one of the scenes.
Yeah.
And it is a small town with this square, and it's just so damn adorable. And I mean, Joe Dante even directed the It's a Good Life segment of the Twilight Zone movie,
Right.
Which is actually a critique of that. But in this movie, it is, I find, typical of the 80s, which was part of this sort of like 50s, early 60s return to these like quaint conservative family values,
Right.
this mythological past of America. And this being sort of a gang movie, which was really big especially in the early 80s with like everything from The Warriors to Class of 1984 or Bad Boys, or, right after Gremlins was like The Lost Boys or Streets of Fire. And then like every cop movie from the late 70s through the mid 80s, Dirty Harry versus gangs, or, some cop versus gangs. It was a total cliche of that time. And it was these sowers of chaos against the American dream.
Well, I think one of the things I've always liked about this movie is when I saw it as a little kid, you believe in that kind of America, especially if you grew up in the early 80s. I remember fondly going to see Reagan speak at something where you go through like metal detectors and you're part of like thousands of little kids and you don't know any better, right? So you're just like, oh my God, there's the president. This is amazing. And this movie is really critical of the small town.
Is it?
I think it is because... one of the things that Joe Dante talks about in one of the interviews on the DVD extras is that they wanted to make a movie that was A Wonderful Life meets The Birds, and that was kind of what they're going for. So they're trying to make everything like hyper Christmassy, because when they do tear it apart, it's even wilder. And it's interesting, you brought up Spielberg, and this movie has his fingerprints all over it, but it's interesting where he pushed and where he didn't. Like, he wanted Gizmo to be the main character and kill Stripe at the end, because in the original script, Gizmo becomes Stripe, and is the villain of the story. And you get this whole like, oh, this unknowable creature, even though it looks sweet, it's going to come and try to kill you in the end because it's this foreign object. It's this foreign entity from some land that no one understands, and that's definitely going on in the movie. But Spielberg was like, look, this thing is way too cute. And there's some apocrypha with the stories, like he wasn't approving designs fast enough, so they modeled it after his Cocker Spaniel. And so then he fell in love with it and wanted it to be part of in the movie way more. Like, it's funny to think about, there was way more Gremlins footage shot, and they were like, wow, there's like too much Gremlin in this movie. And that's crazy because there's nothing but Gremlin in this movie. So you wonder what it was going to be. So you have that going on, and where Spielberg changes the end of the film to feature Gizmo killing Stripe instead of Billy killing Stripe, who was Gizmo. And he really forced that, and I think that more than anything changes the tone of the movie. But the most controversial scene in the film is when Phoebe Cates' character Kate is talking about why she hates Christmas. And the reason why she hates Christmas is because her dad, dressed up as Santa Claus, tried to go down the chimney, got stuck in the chimney, died, and they found his body like a week and a half later, something like that. That's a pretty horrifying thing. And when you're like 7 years old and you see this movie like I did, that's when you find out there's no Santa Claus. You're like, oh, whoa. So that was a scene that Joe Dante fought for. And then Spielberg was like, look, I want you to take it out, but it's your movie. So what do you want to do? And he's like, I want to leave it in. And that scene is one of the most memorable scenes in the movie. And it's great. And you don't know whether to laugh at it or take it seriously. And
well,
I think
it gives the movie weight.
Yeah.
And without it, the movie doesn't have a lot of weight, which it sort of needs as, like, pardon the metaphor, but it needs some sort of ballast against all the gags, because otherwise it's in a really long movie of gags.
Yeah, I mean, gag is the best word for it. I mean, it is a bunch of silly shit that happens through the whole movie.
And I will say, it's funny. Like, the gags are actually quite good.
Yeah.
They're smart. They're well executed. They're just janky enough to be charming.
Yep. I mean, all kinds of stuff, like how all the gremlins just kind of express themselves. And it is, I agree with you about it being a gang movie, and that, like, there's the gremlin that has the knife, and there's the gremlin with the gun, and there's the gremlin that's a flasher, and then there's the gremlin that for some reason is a lady that's like Strike's
Well, that's
girlfriend.
Gremlins too.
Well, in Gremlins, in the first scene, there is a character, a gremlin that's like wearing makeup and a coat.
Oh, yeah.
But he hasn't taken a secret serum like in Gremlins 2 to transform. He hasn't taken hormones. He's
Right.
He's just, I guess, a transvestite. So I don't know. But this movie is just so madcap. Like, especially once the gremlins happen. Once they've transformed out of being Mogwai, they become this just force of chaos. And they just immediately go into the town and start wrecking shit. And one of the funniest scenes is when they run over Mr. Futterman and his wife. And Mr. Futterman is probably a character I can imagine you would have some problems with.
Well, I don't. He's not. I don't know him personally. So
Right. But well, I think that like I'd seen a thing online where they were like, okay, well, this movie's super racist, and I was like, where are they even getting this? I don't like. And then there's two things for sure. One, when Rand Peltzer's talking to the old man in the Chinatown shop,
the gong,
like he says something, and then there's like a gong noise. But
Yeah.
I mean, that happens in 16 Candles like 6 times with Long Duck Dong, which is one of the best names for a character ever.
Well, I think having a character that's totally xenophobic and
Right.
buys American is very different from the soundtrack of the film.
Yeah.
Stooping to cliches.
Yeah.
Like the sort of like most obvious, most ridiculous cliches that were just so abundant in that era of American filmmaking that weren't about like, oh, this is like a sort of multicultural. It's not multi anything. It's just about like making a joke about another culture. Like, I don't want to overstate how, like, you know, there's way more racist than a gong in the soundtrack of a comedy, but come on, guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah, okay, so maybe Mr. Futterman is just a character, a throwback character. And his main purpose in the film is to just introduce the idea of what a gremlin is from his perspective, which is, you know, he says, oh, it's these things that foreigners put in our machines in World War II to cause them to break, which is real weird because most of his rants are against foreign machinery. So are they putting the gremlins in our machines and making them worse? Or are their machines corrupted and you shouldn't have them? Like, which is it, you know? And he kind of goes back and forth about how, you know, American equipment is so great, but his snowplow keeps breaking down. Like the whole time, the snowplow is completely unreliable except for when the gremlins turn it on and run him and his wife over.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's definitely a technology critique going on in this movie too, because they talk about like American versus foreign machines, but the machines that break down more than anything else are Peltzer's inventions, which are terrible. And they turn every single easy task into a difficult task. Like there's a juicer that destroys the kitchen. There's the egg cracker that sprays eggs everywhere.
A smokeless ashtray that billows smoke everywhere.
Yeah.
And the bathroom buddy, which is actually huge, and just the only thing you actually see it do is ejaculate toothpaste all over its maker. A part of this movie that really gave me a lot of pause to question was it really made me think about the question of what is a B movie. Because I'm never really interested in conversations about high and low. However, I think that discussing B movies is often actually a conversation about economics of filmmaking, which we've discussed before.
Sure.
But this movie uses so many, like, B movies are oftentimes, I think, something we apply to movies that didn't have the budget to see ideas through.
Right.
And so they tend to be janky. And filmmakers who don't have huge budgets tend to leave certain things unresolved, whether it's plot points, whether it's good coverage, whether it's special effects that aren't fully realized.
Right.
I sort of feel like that's what a B movie is. We tend to go like, oh, B movie, they're not as good as what A movies. But oftentimes, like, no, you do what you can with a budget, and narrative filmmaking is generally very economically intensive. So if you don't have the budget, you got to let something slide.
Sure.
And sometimes it ends up being laughable. Gremlins is sort of all of those laughables with a huge budget, I found. Because despite how expensive those puppets were, they're often just janky enough to be sort of like there's a gag and it's both funny and janky at the same time, which adds to its charm and adds to the humor of it. I think there's a certain absurdity in it. And I find Gremlins does walk that line. It's a little bit postmodern. It's a little bit like self-knowing, self-aware, like you were referring to cartoons. A lot of the gags are cartoon gags.
Right.
But I think the most extreme example is actually in Gremlins 2, where it's just like so heavy-handed and so forced and taken to this next level where I found it actually wasn't funny. It was just sort of this wash of shitty 20-second gags that are directionless.
Gremlins 2 is totally over the top, and if you haven't seen it in a while or don't feel like watching it, you can go watch the Key and Peele skit about Gremlins 2 where Hollywood from Mannequin rewrites the script, which is kind of interesting because the reality of Gremlins 2 is that it was the studio was completely hands off, and you would never know it watching the movie because there's a scene where a gremlin gets a Warner Brothers shield tattooed on his chest. And then there's another scene where one of the gremlins has become a bat creature and flies out through a wall and leaves the Batman logo. And it wasn't just any Batman logo. It was the logo from the film that had come out the year before with Michael Keaton. And it's just constantly talking about itself and these goofy gags. And the film itself is loaded with 1950s B-movie Easter eggs. I mean, you have Gomez Adams is the janitor. The actor that plays Gomez Adams is the janitor that gets Gizmo wet in Gremlins 2 and like kicks off the chaos. There's like Christopher Lee is an evil scientist in Gremlins 2.
Hulk Hogan breaks the fourth wall.
Yeah, and this is kind of an interesting thing that totally blew my mind because I had seen Gremlins 2 in the theater, and in the theater there's a part halfway through where the film breaks, like the film catches on fire, and then the audience gets trapped in the gate. It gets trapped in the gate, and you, as the audience, you see these gremlins are in front of the projector making all this noise and all this shit, and then all of a sudden, the film comes back on, and Hulk Hogan is in the audience, and he turns around, breaks the fourth wall, and yells at the gremlins that the Grimsters just can't compete with the Hulkster, and that they need to turn the movie back on. It's just super weird. And then in the VHS version of it, they come on like through the static of the film. So it becomes a VHS thing, and they start flipping channels instead of putting a different film on or anything like that. They start flipping through channels, and Hulk Hogan's not in it. And to me, the idea that the film that I rented was not the film that I saw in the theater was crazy. I couldn't even believe that anybody would have the audacity to change a movie. And to me, it ruined the VHS experience to me, even though looking back on it, it's pretty cool that they made two versions.
Right.
Like, I wanted to see Hulk Hogan because I fucking loved Hulk Hogan. And I was super disappointed in that. It's crazy, too, to think about how much of the stuff that's in Gremlins 2 and Gremlins is still kind of in the news. Like, banks are still kind of evil. Like there's a Donald Trump-esque character named Daniel Clamp in Gremlins 2, although he's a little bit different than what you get out of
He's
Donald
a little
Trump.
bit more Ted Turner and sort of has a charming ending.
Yeah, the actor came in and I guess was so likable that they kind of tweaked the character to be less evil and a little bit more optimistic. So he has a kind of Elon Musk optimism that I think that Trump does not have, for sure does not have. And it's just a wild movie, and it flopped super bad, even though the first one did so well. I mean, it's weird that there was a 7-year hiatus between the two movies.
Well, I think going back to my comments about B movies, my observations about B movies is, have you seen Troll 2?
No.
Oh, okay. So Troll 2, which has nothing to do with Troll 1. It's also the subject of a documentary called Worst Best Movie. I believe that's what it's called. Troll 2 is sort of generally considered one of the worst movies ever made, with The Room and Birdemic and Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's really well known for being just an atrocity. And it's actually it's called Troll 2, but it's about goblins. There are no trolls in it. It's incredibly low budget, and it has all these puppets, and it's really janky, and it's a fascinating train wreck. And I feel like Gremlins, but especially Gremlins 2, is like I guess I'm only speaking to people who are listening to this podcast who've seen it, but I find them to be really similar, not just because they're about these puppet creatures driving a narrative, but because there's this incredible jankiness. You know, it's like when you watch a B movie and you have those moments of like, what the fuck was that? And it could only be the product of someone trying to solve a problem with no money. I found that Gremlins 2 is so far to the opposite direction that it's not about problem solving. It's about, like, we have such absolute freedom that we don't have to be tethered to any rules.
Sure.
And without any sort of rules, I mean, I think we have these illusions about making art that rules are the enemy, that you need absolute creative freedom. And I think that's a weird lie. You have to tether yourself. If nobody's going to tether you from the exterior, you need to tether yourself internally and make your own set of rules. And Gremlins 2 had no rules.
Right.
And I mean, I'm glad it didn't, because then we get that amazing Key and Peele sketch. But what a sad, sad movie.
I love it. Like,
well, another layer to what I think is what I sort of disliked about Gremlins, and then it went overboard in Gremlins 2, is that I don't expect movies to be a mirror of reality. Right. I don't expect movies to be anything. Movies can be anything. I don't care if it's a structuralist film or it has a narrative, or it doesn't matter. But there is a fine line when narrative film goes from trying to tell a story that's rooted in a reality to Hollywood films that are more about replicating the reality as we have come to know it from Hollywood films. So people on screen talk not the way we talk in real life, not the way they talk on some weird planet they invented, because again, there are no rules here necessarily, but that this is the way people talk in movies. And then another movie comes along and replicates that sort of trope of dialogue. And I feel like Gremlins, and especially Gremlins 2, are about, okay, is this funny, or is this what a movie gag looks like? Is this a comedic moment, or are you just sort of like riffing on what a comedic moment is supposed to be, as we have learned from previous Hollywood films?
Yeah, I feel like those questions are for sure more live in Gremlins, because you really kind of don't know what to think of certain scenes in Gremlins, because it's a horror movie.
Yeah.
It definitely had some of the horror scenes toned down. When you think about the mom's scene where she kills the 3 gremlins, it's a violent, graphic scene. And that particular scene, along with the totality of the Temple of Doom, the sequel to Raiders of the Lost Ark, are the reason why we have a PG-13 rating today, is that scene. And they were particularly worried about kids putting pets in microwaves after the mom killed the gremlin in the microwave, which, to my knowledge, never actually happened. It was like another satanic panic type of thing. But the scene with the mom, she goes full Carol from The Walking Dead on these gremlins. It's kind of awesome how empowered the female characters in this movie really are. True. Like Phoebe Cates' character, Kate, is bartending for these goblins, and man, that scene, looking at it now, just reminds me of so many nights of bartending for myself. Just a crew of just swarming malicious cretins just yelling for alcohol. I mean, I know you know what I'm talking about. But in Gremlins 2, it's weird. Like, they really tried to do what they were doing. I mean, the reason why the creatures are so extreme in Gremlins 2 is because they tried to get Rick Baker. And Rick Baker was like, I just don't feel like running your puppets. I don't want to do that. Yeah. And then they were like, no, go nuts. And he's like, really? And they're like, no, for real, go nuts. And he's like, okay, well, here's what I got. And he created all these really, I mean, it's easy to look back on this 1991 effort and kind of shit on it. But those creatures were really technically superior for their time as far as puppets goes, especially the brain gremlin. They used the same animatronic for his mouth that they use in Disneyland, and it was incredibly expensive. And then you get the spider gremlin that comes in to Slayer's Angel of Death.
I gotta give it the Slayer moment.
Yeah.
With like a woman trapped in the web, sort of like the Rat video.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah.
And there's definitely like some punk rockers must have been involved here, because the super corny dance scene with Gizmo, with that 50s rock song, it was originally supposed to be a Billy Idol punk song. And they were like, yeah, we got the rights to it, no problem. In the end, Billy Idol's like, fuck this movie, and wouldn't let his song be associated with it, which is pretty funny. But I guess Slayer, even more evil, decided that they were okay with it. But, you know, the way I've been talking about this movie really reminds me of something that Owen Gleiberman talked about. He's a film critic, and he was just on Bret Easton Ellis's podcast, and he talked about films like Stranger Things and films like Star Wars, and especially the new Star Wars franchises, which is what's going on is it's not a film as much as it is an information product. So part of the pleasure of those films is connecting all of these points in this larger canon and sort of memorizing what's really cool. And so everything I've talked about so far has been totally like that. For me, I have a lot of childhood memories of this film, but what I found really compelling about preparing for the show, for whatever reason, is all this minutia, all this weird trivia that, like, I feel like if there was a Gremlins pub quiz right now, I could just go wreck that shit. And that's not really, I don't think, a good way of looking at a film. And yet I found myself incapable of not doing that.
Right.
And it's really similar to what we did when we reviewed Stranger Things,
Absolutely.
which is we're pointing out all these Easter eggs and these gags. And this movie was this movie predates when Stranger Things would have even taken place.
Right.
You know, so this movie took place at an earlier date than a movie that's rooted in nostalgia does. Or once again, calling it a movie, Stranger Things is a show. I can't stop myself. But this movie, Gremlins, is just loaded with the same kind of stuff. You know, the people who made it had a love for B movies and horror, and you know, there's just so much stuff in it. There's multiple references to E.T. There's all kinds of different sci-fi films on television. Billy's room is full of all kinds of posters, and I think the difference though between this movie and those movies and Stranger Things is that it's not pulled forward for the delight of the audience. Like, I'm retroactively going back with a trained eye, and I was a bit disturbed at myself that I had been so thoroughly trained to look at this older movie in the same way that I look at movies now. And I just wanted to tell myself to fucking stop it. But after I watched my 6th video essay on things you missed in Gremlins, I'm like totally hooked on it like a junkie.
Right.
Like, you know, I don't know that means that I'm even a critical film viewer anymore. Maybe I'm trapped in this same game that everyone else is trapped in. Dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to react to that, but I totally hear you. I mean, there's a certain way in which once you are given a critical apparatus, whether you even agree with it or not,
Sure.
it is yours. You know, once you go to school and you learn how to view a text through a Marxist lens, through a feminist lens, through a libertarian lens, whatever you want, like that's part of your arsenal.
Yeah.
And the more it's reinforced, like the more classes you take from Marxist informed professors, you will never be able to watch a movie without having some sort of Marxist critical apparatus applied. Just like right now, we those of us who are not currently in academia, where we're getting a lot of our critical apparatus is from like YouTube videos and the like, and they are collectively very aggressive in getting us to look at things as intertextual objects, and it's really hard to turn that off where you're watching something that's from your childhood and you're still applying the same lens to it as things that were made to be intertextual, like a Marvel film or like Stranger Things.
Well, it's almost like a shallow intertextuality. You know, it's just stuff that's super easy to pick up. Because, like, everything I've said so far, anyone could say. Like, you could go spend 30 minutes on YouTube, go look at the IMDb, go look at the Wikipedia, and then watch this film, and basically replicate and not even critique. We're just basically talking about things that we learned about the movie. It reminds me a little bit of the difference between the type of book report that you might do
Yes.
at an, as a younger person or in an undergraduate course or a lower division undergraduate course. And then what we should be doing is talking about, what the film means. And so at that point, what does this film mean? I don't even know. I just enjoyed it as a kid. To me, the technology critique is the most interesting thing that you might pull out of this for now.
But is it... Okay, so here's a question.
Sure.
Is its critique of technology actually an interesting critique, or is it merely, if you're going to go like, well, what is this movie saying? Well, it's definitely got this thing about technology because of what Gremlins were historically as a myth and about these inventions, and so it's saying something about it, but what? So is it that could be something one could dismantle and deconstruct, or is it that it's actually like an active and engaged critique of technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean,
Gremlins 2 has more of it because the building itself is this revolutionary piece of technology, and then it's actually the electricity gremlin that kills them all.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the building, in a way, in Gremlins 2 is a completely immersive version of Peltzer's inventions. Like they are, instead
it does
of them,
not work.
And I think if you look at Gremlins and Gremlins 2 and the growth of technology, I think mirrors kind of where we're at now. I mean, you look at the quaint small town is being ruined by two things: the greed of Mrs. Deagle and Judge Reinhold's character, who's the president of the bank. Judge Reinhold just got arrested for some sort of drug offense. Awesome.
Aww.
Yeah, too bad. Once again, you live too long. It happens to you.
What drug?
Who knows? I didn't want to look too closely at it. I was like, I like Judge Reinhold. I'm not going to get too much into his business. But, like the small town quaintness is under attack from that, and later under attack from the Gremlins. But Peltzer's inventions ruin every single nice thing, like the mom making cookies. Like she's trying to make the cookies and she goes to break the eggs with the stupid egg smashing machine, and it just makes a mess. And then when the Gremlins come in, they're also making a similar type of mess, and really like they're just disturbing her homemaking. And all these inventions are designed to make life better, but ultimately do they make life worse? I mean, look at the traffic situation in San Francisco with Uber, right? That's a thing that was supposed to make traffic better here, but instead there's 50,000 Uber drivers in any particular day driving around locking traffic up.
And they're all double parking somewhere.
Yeah, I mean...
At any given moment.
Yeah. I mean, so that's, and then the types of things that Peltzer is inventing are, what Fight Club lampoons is versatile solutions for modern living. And like, you don't need to have the space save to have that like bathroom buddy, like all this stuff is completely unnecessary to make your life better, but it's a step forward. And, like there aren't really computers in this franchise, but it's pretty easy to imagine like if this movie had a reboot, you could imagine it sort of taking place in Silicon Valley and there being some sort of app that turns on all the lights or something, but it doesn't go right because the Gremlins. It's the one thing I think that still affects the way I think about this movie is like the technology part of it.
Yeah, for me, whether it's saying something, if I can glean what it's saying, I think I'm going to back up to the whole "It's a Wonderful Life" and this myth of classic small town America and family values and all that. However, I will say to its credit, if you took the quaint A Christmas Story-ness out of Gremlins, you pretty much have Gremlins 2, Ghoulies. You have like, everything that followed Gremlins or tried to profit off of the success of Gremlins basically did that fucking thing that copycats often do, which is take the most obvious element and none of the things that actually made it successful.
Right.
The gags in Gremlins were great, but what I feel like made Gremlins a success, probably as a film to me, the way in which I liked it is, and it probably its success as a cultural phenomenon at the box office, is that it sets up Billy and his parents, who are really good, well-rendered characters, very quickly. You get a really good sense of that family. Phoebe Cates is you just get her character quickly, and she has that very dark moment, and so you feel for her. And so as the town starts crashing down, you have an emotional attachment to these characters. And so, the mom kicking ass, if it was just like someone you didn't really know or care about and had no depth, who was just kicking ass, you're not on her side. She's just someone, that's the Phantom Menace issue, right? It's just like, I don't care about any of these characters, so I don't care if any of them are live or die.
Right.
But then Gremlins 2 and Ghoulies and all those, they don't have any sort
Critters.
of like critters. Yes, exactly. We need the weight. We need the characters to, and again, I don't think movies need to have good characters, but Gremlins did.
Right.
And then if you take those characters out of Gremlins, you get these shitty knockoffs.
I think what Gremlins has too going for it is good character actors. And I think that's something that is really absent from Hollywood films now, is like those faces that from different movies, like the old man that plays Futtermans and a bunch of stuff. And they really bring a lot of life to these goofy side roles. And something else I like about this movie is the main protagonist isn't super forward. It's not really all about Billy. I mean, he's in there, but it allows his character gives space to the other characters in the film. And I think that's done very well. Like, you really do kind of care about the neighbor, even though he's sort of a xenophobe and he hates foreign everything. But he is endearing in his World War II bomber jacket that he's wrapped up in while he drives a snowplow down the street. I also love that everyone can walk everywhere in this town. Like, every time something breaks down, they're like, oh crap, I'll just walk. And it's 4 blocks away. Part of me that, like, you think about like all the sustainability writing about walkable cities, and you're like, wow, this is an ultimate city. Like, everyone can walk to everything they need right there. It's like this beautiful little town. And
the Gremlins can just wait, one block, they can just destroy the city.
Yeah, they just rip it to pieces. But in Gremlins 2, there's that kind of subplot about how Kate and Billy have come to New York and to sort of make it. They wanted more than what they had in their small town. And Billy finds himself basically in like a shadow career. He wants to be a cartoon artist, but he's drawing facades for Clamp's, I guess they're condos or something like that. They're these Chinatown redevelopment project or something like that. But it's ultimately yuppie condos. But as the film goes on and everything explodes and is just completely destroyed, Clamp has this moment where he sees Billy's drawing of Kingston Falls and he's like, that's the ticket. That's what I want to make. And that is something that hasn't left my mind since I watched both these movies, because it feels like that's what's happening in America right now. Is America has just fucking had it with gadgetry and bullshit and all this like neo cool stuff, and they want to return to Kingston Falls. They want nostalgia. They want to make America great again. And I feel like I'm back to that just adoration of South Park's 20th season, where like the member berries, it's like I'm watching it, and the whole time I'm watching these films, I'm thinking, man, I wouldn't mind living in like a Kingston Falls. And then Billy and Kate, they talk about, in one scene, they have this moment where they're like, man, I should have just stayed in Kingston Falls. I'd probably be the vice president of the bank by now.
Right.
And so it's this whole idea that the big city coastal move is a lie. And I think that's a moment we're going to get to pretty soon, because you have all these like weird little art towns like Carson City and Ashland, all these places where people are moving to that aren't major coasts, or like Bisbee, Arizona, where Doug Stanhope's whole crew is. That the comedian Doug Stanhope, like it seems like people want that nostalgic town more than they want the Clamp building.
So you just dropped a reference to member berries. You should probably...
Yeah, I keep doing this. I assume that everybody's still watching South Park. But in South Park...
Before you do, I'm going to say season 19 and 20 of South Park are the best. It's been a pretty consistent show and was certainly incredible in the early seasons for how shocking it was. Mm-hmm. But I kind of can't get over how good that show got recently.
Yeah. Well, 19 and 20 in particular... It's pretty easy to like hate on social justice warriors or be completely fearful of the alt-right and everything in between, right? And it would be easy to just shit on people being too sensitive or PC. But what South Park does really well is it looks at the surface of what's going on, completely lampoons it, and then digs underneath and shows you what's actually underneath all that shit, which is neoliberalism. And South Park takes a fucking major stab at it. And I would say that 19 and 20, season 19 and 20, are South Park's most philosophically well-rendered critiques on culture. I think probably the best ones that have happened.
Yeah.
And, they just hit on everything. And one of the smartest things in the show is there's these berries that are called member berries. And I don't think anybody ever even explains where they come from. But the whole time they're just whispering sweet nostalgia into people's ears. They constantly talk like a member berry dialogue will go, "Remember Chewbacca?
I remember Chewbacca. I
Remember
remember
Gremlins?
Chewbacca.
Remember this? Remember that?"
Yeah.
But they always sneak in something dark, like remember segregated bathrooms? And so it's this idea that there's a trade-off of darkness when you want this old nostalgia. Like, not only do you get the sweet things that you remember, you get the bad things that you remember that you maybe don't quite remember. And it's pretty smart. And like, I know this is our Christmas episode and we're talking about South Park. It's kind of weird, but I mean, I think the first episode of South Park is a Christmas episode, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's totally okay, folks. Don't hate on my South Park love.
Also, I want to go back to Billy as a character because what you described about Billy sort of makes me think about, we just did an episode about the Lost Boys and actually how similar these movies are in that it's hard to locate the main characters in terms of age.
Right.
And I think that also plays into the big question mark of who is this movie for? Gremlins turns out to be for everybody. The Lost Boys turns out to be for everybody. But it's kind of like, Gremlins, it feels like a kid's movie. Not just because it's puppets, but because it's got these cute elements and there's all these toy product placements and things like that.
Sure.
But it's a pretty adult-themed movie in a lot of ways. And then Lost Boys has similar issues. But I think I made that go like it was leading somewhere, but that was actually, that was the point.
I wonder if movies could even be made like Gremlins 2 are made now, where they're just like, look, we just want you to make it. Here's some money. Have at it. I wonder what the dollar threshold is for that. Because it seems like a lot of these auteur horror movie directors, they have chosen to go with lower budgets. I don't think, who knows what the budget of Stranger Things is, but the original budget of Gremlins is much higher than any of the other films we've looked at so far. So you wonder, like, at what dollar amount do the studio notes start coming hard and fast at, and if there's ever a moment where somebody's just going to have free reign. I mean, can you think of any directors that have just complete free reign now?
I don't know, because I don't really know how that works. Like Tarantino, I have no idea who.
Like Wes Anderson, maybe?
Probably.
But even
probably
then,
David Lynch. I don't know.
Yeah, but even then, they're like masters, right? Like Joe Dante, great director, but like, would you put him in the category of... most people would not know his name today.
Right. Well, he also wasn't slogging away doing these moderately independent films to great success for many, many years and sort of proving that his brand of auteurness is actually going to be solvent.
And part of the look of his films is what I think of when I think of Hollywood films. The Howling looks like a Hollywood horror movie to me. I mean, and it's great. I think it might be, I know a lot of people love Ginger Snaps and we have a lot of goths listening, so sorry, but Howling I think might be the best werewolf movie ever made. I mean, what's better? Maybe American Werewolf in London.
I don't know that the word best, I don't know that I would use words like best about films, but I think The Howling is a more realized film, but Ginger Snaps I love that movie.
Yeah, I know a lot of people do. I almost don't even consider it it's hard to consider it a werewolf movie because there's not a lot of lycanthropy in it. It's more
Wolfing Out.
Yeah, there's not as much wolfing out. It has... actually, I'm reminded of probably my favorite one, which is Wolf with Jack Nicholson. The cinematography of that movie is very interesting because a lot of it takes place in an office. He's like an executive of some sort, and he gets bitten, and he's slowly becoming a werewolf, and he kind of becomes this like alpha male as it goes on. And they do a lot with the scenery where like the office starts looking more enclosed and more prisonish as he moves on. They accentuate like the bars and the windows and things like that. As he becomes more of a wolf, he is caged by society. You know, those sorts of things are becoming more interesting to me. Like when you use the set to express themes in the film. And that's something I think Gremlins did pretty well, is like it's expressing a lot through the scenery. You know, like whether it be Corey Feldman, again, coming through dressed as a Christmas tree. You know, a lot of that stuff is really endearing. And then again, it just gets super weird. Like, 'cause there's a lot of like heartwarming feeling around the Christmas trees. And then there's a gremlin in the Christmas tree and its eyes are glowing. And it adds these really interesting threats to things that should be safe. You know, and
which is what good horror movies should do.
Yeah. And I think that's why, I mean, I also think about like the very end of this film when the voiceover comes back and the actor's like, well, you know, next time something goes in the fritz, turn on all your lights because it might just be a gremlin. When I was a little kid, I went and turned on all the lights. You know, it really had an effect on me in a way I think other horror movies didn't. Like I saw Poltergeist when I was a little kid. I saw, like, my parents just did not care if there were just anything they were watching, I was watching. And this was a movie that I knew it was a horror movie, and my mom was super into horror movies, but this was the first horror movie I felt was like my horror movie because it was such a kid's movie too. You know, and this formula of like cuddly creature that's evil, it's definitely carried on. I mean, we have Attack the Block, which is excellent.
It's fun.
You know, it's kind of an updated East London version of Critters, I guess. Do you think, given a chance to own a Mogwai, you would own a Mogwai?
Not interested.
No. Because you don't like pets, or just do you find that you don't have the responsibility that's required?
Well, so I only know two kinds of Mogwai. There's Gizmo and all the other ones. Gizmo's cloying, and all the other ones are assholes. So, pass?
Yeah, I could see. I mean, you have a nice home. I could probably get pretty wrecked, but you can't tell me it wouldn't be sort of enjoyable to see Gremlins just tear through San Francisco right now. Just like ripping apart a hackerspace, spilling Soylent all over the ground, just wrecking shit.
Okay, yeah. I'm kind of sold now.
Yeah. I mean, you just throw the little bastard.
You just sold me so hard.
Yeah, I mean, like, it would be great to see, I think, you know, just, or maybe not. I mean, who needs chaos? They do kill people, and that's kind of wrong. But, yeah.
Details.
Yeah. But you wonder how many people, like, you think the Futtermans die, but they come back in Gremlins, too.
Yeah. Although, well, while we're on the subject, let's back up and talk about racism. Black guy dies first.
This is true. Interesting. Like,
speaking of, like, 80s racial stereotypes that are just like so like obvious and tired.
Yeah, there's an even more interest. I mean, back to this fucking trivia related to the movie, but that actor was up for the role of Han Solo at one point. What? And yeah, it's kind of a weird little thing. But he was up for the role of Han Solo, and there was some concern over, you know, the love interest between a white dude and black.
Oh God,
a black dude and white lady. Back then, it was like nope. And then and so obviously Harrison Ford became Han Solo, but you know, just an interesting little detail. But yeah, his death was supposed to be way worse. He was supposed to be completely stabbed to death by hypodermic needles.
Yeah, like Seven style.
But it's kind of again, I'm playing like the South Park member berry game that I am just completely addicted to. Is, you know, he knows one scientist, and it's his biology teacher.
From junior high, I think.
Yeah. Which is, you know, in Stranger Things, all the kids, they're like, oh, we need to figure out how alternative dimensions might theoretically work. Let's call our teacher. You know, it's hilarious. And then just a bad scientist, you know, not really doing great studies, leaving a sandwich next to the Mogwai, you know, just, he doesn't call in anybody for any extra help, has this, like, potential xenomorph sitting in the back of the classroom. and it basically is like a xenomorph, like an alien. I mean, the egg thing that they become looks a lot like the face hugger thing. But yeah, black dude dies first. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, it's officially a horror movie.
Totally.
Yeah, if you had any doubts that it was a horror movie, there you go. When I was doing research for Gremlins, I found myself really getting lulled into this enjoyment for 80s nostalgia, and I started looking up the other movies that the actress had been in, and like right back into that Memberberry thing. You know, you're like, oh, remember Red Dawn? Remember Goonies? Remember Corey Feldman's movies? You know, you're like, oh my God. And I wonder if that's even bad. Like, I'm suspicious of it because I'm suspicious of anything that I do, because like I feel like, I just feel like I'm constantly just trying to wrestle myself from being terrible, you know? And I'm like, okay, is this adoration of nostalgia just some natural fun thing, or is it just something terrible about me? And by extension, terrible about our audience. But maybe that's unfair.
Well, let us not let our listeners dictate everything, but let's open up. We can't say our next episode because that is Beetlejuice.
Right. We're going to do Beetlejuice next.
Let's open it up to our listeners via Facebook, or, you can send messages through Instagram or whatever. What should we cover next?
Yeah. I mean, we'll probably do maybe like a Facebook poll or something like that. We'll put it up a couple times and see what people want to respond to, because we have picked things that we were interested in, things that we thought would be fun, things that might be a little bit of a stretch. Because I think you had reservations about Lost Boys, like what were you going to say about it? But I think it ended up being a pretty good episode.
Yeah.
And same thing with this Gremlins discussion. I mean, Gremlins is a pretty dumb movie that I happen to love.
We finally got to it.
Yeah, it's a pretty dumb movie. But it's also great. You know, it doesn't have to be super smart all the time. And then there are things that are smart about it. But it's like, man, do I just love the idea that a bunch of people who make movies were given more money than they should have been, didn't want to do it, and for like basically like Gremlins 2 is a big middle finger to the studio. I mean, they really did stick it to Warner Brothers, and apparently did just enough to make it endearing enough for them. Like, you know, it opens with the Warner Brothers cartoon, which they loved. The Warner Brothers tattoo on the chest of the gremlin, which I mentioned earlier. Apparently, the studio execs just loved it. They thought it was the smartest thing that they had ever seen. And, I mean, it's pretty obviously bad. You know, like that whole thing. And it was made to be bad. Like, they did it on purpose. And that sort of anarchism is always going to get respect from me.
Yeah. So, Merry Christmas. Let's fade to black and roll the credits.
I love that you said Merry Christmas, by the way.
We're dropping this on the 20th. What do you mean?
Well, instead of Happy Holidays.
Fuck it. It's Christmas, dude.
Yeah.
I mean, ain't nobody less Christian than me, and it's Christmas, and I know it.
Yeah.
I know it.
Probably by next year, I'll be celebrating Yule as I grow and more fond of pagan gods. Hopefully, they will shower me with victories in the coming year, as they will to you, Mark. Hopefully, Odin and Thor will grant us victory over all of our enemies.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Helping me smote them. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, watch Beetlejuice. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Please don't anger the gods. Like the Gremlins are engineered by extraterrestrials.
Fuck. This episode's gonna make me dislike this movie even more than I already do.
This movie's great.